You see, there is a curious misunderstanding about the empath. People imagine the healed empath as someone endlessly gentle, endlessly available, glowing with kindness like a candle that never burns down, a saint of sensitivity, a permanent refuge for the wounded world. But that image is precisely the misunderstanding. Because healing does not make an empath softer in the way people expect. It makes them clearer. Healing does not dull sensitivity, it refines it. The empath does not lose their ability to feel, sense, or intuit what is happening beneath the surface of things. What changes is not the depth of perception, but the relationship to it. Before healing, sensitivity feels like an open wound. Everything enters, everything stays, everything hurts. The empath confuses awareness with responsibility and assumes that feeling something means they must carry it. Clarity arrives when the empath realizes that perception is not ownership. They can notice sadness without becoming sad, observe tension without absorbing it, and understand another's pain without turning it into a personal obligation. This distinction is subtle, yet transformative. The nervous system begins to relax because it no longer has to stay on constant alert, scanning for threats disguised as emotions. Unhealed empathy is often reactive. It rushes to soothe, to fix, to explain, to prevent discomfort, especially the discomfort of others. Healing introduces pause. In that pause, the empath learns to ask what is actually theirs to respond to and what is simply theirs to witness. The impulse to overgive fades, not because care disappears, but because discernment appears. Clarity also changes communication. The empath no longer wraps truth in excessive gentleness to avoid rejection. Words become simpler, cleaner, and more direct. There is less emotional leakage, less over-justification, less apology for existing. Feelings are acknowledged without being dramatized, and honesty replaces emotional entanglement. As clarity deepens, relationships shift. The empath stops resonating with chaos because chaos requires confusion to survive. Emotional manipulation loses its grip when guilt no longer has an entry point. What once felt like being soft was actually being unprotected. Healing does not harden the empath, it stabilizes them. Sensitivity remains, but it is now anchored, informed by self-trust rather than fear, guided by awareness instead of obligation. Boundaries are often misunderstood as acts of separation, as though to draw a line is to withdraw love. Yet boundaries do not exist to keep others out, they exist to keep the self intact. Without them, care turns into depletion and generosity becomes a quiet form of self-abandonment. What appears as openness is often an absence of protection, and what is praised as kindness can be rooted in the fear of losing connection. An unformed boundary is not the same as compassion. When someone says yes while their body is saying no, something within them fractures. Over time, this fracture teaches the nervous system that connection requires endurance rather than choice. Healing begins when a person realizes that respect cannot be postponed until others learn how to give it. It must be embodied first. A boundary does not need to be defended, justified, or explained at length. Its strength comes from consistency, not force. The moment one stops negotiating their limits internally, the world begins to feel that stability. Some will resist it, especially those who benefited from access without accountability. That resistance is not a signal to retreat, but evidence that the boundary is real. Self-respect expresses itself quietly. It shows up as leaving conversations that drain the spirit, declining roles that require self-erasure, and no longer translating one's needs into acceptable language for others. It is the willingness to disappoint in order to remain honest. This honesty does not seek to punish or control, it simply states what is true. As boundaries solidify, relationships reorganize. Some fall away, not because love was absent, but because it depended on imbalance. Others deepen, strengthened by clarity and mutual regard. Energy once scattered and overextension returns home. What remains is a sense of inner alignment, where care flows without resentment and presence no longer comes at the cost of peace. Empathy becomes distorted when it requires the disappearance of the self. What is often praised as deep compassion is, in many cases, a trained reflex to minimize one's own needs in order to maintain connection. This form of empathy listens closely to others while growing increasingly distant from itself. It senses every shift in emotion, but ignores the quiet signals of exhaustion, resentment, and misalignment that arise within. True power emerges when empathy no longer demands self-erasure. This shift does not dull awareness, it anchors it. The empath learns that feeling another's experience does not require surrendering their own center. Instead of collapsing inward or reaching outward compulsively, they remain present, grounded in their body and breath. From this place, empathy becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. When the self is no longer sacrificed, emotional energy stops leaking. The empath no longer chases harmony at the expense of truth or absorbs tension to keep the peace. They can remain calm in the presence of strong emotions without being overtaken by them. This steadiness is often misread as detachment, but it is actually containment, the capacity to hold awareness without losing form. Power, in this sense, is not dominance or control. It is coherence. It is the ability to feel deeply while standing firmly. The empath stops translating their worth through usefulness and begins to trust their inherent presence. Listening becomes more accurate because it is no longer filtered through fear of rejection or the need to be needed. As self-erasure dissolves, empathy sharpens. The empath can name what they observe without rescuing, acknowledge pain without absorbing it, and offer care without entanglement. Relationships shift from emotional dependency to mutual recognition. Compassion becomes cleaner, less exhausting, and more effective, rooted in clarity rather than guilt, sustained by self-honoring instead of self-sacrifice. Selectivity is often mistaken for indifference, especially by those who were accustomed to unrestricted access. When an empath heals, they do not lose warmth or care. They lose the compulsion to be everywhere, for everyone all the time. What once looked like openness was frequently overexposure, a porousness that left them drained and confused. Healing introduces discernment, the quiet ability to recognize where energy belongs and where it does not. Being selective means the empath no longer equates availability with love. They understand that constant responsiveness is not a measure of devotion, and that presence offered under pressure is rarely genuine. Time, attention, and emotional labor become conscious choices rather than automatic reactions. This shift can feel abrupt to others, not because the empath has withdrawn affection, but because they have withdrawn unconscious compliance. Coldness lacks feeling. Selectivity preserves it. By choosing fewer, healthier connections, the empath protects the depth of their emotional capacity. They stop engaging in dynamics that revolve around crisis, intensity, or emotional volatility, not out of judgment, but because chaos requires self-neglect to sustain itself. Calm, grounded connection becomes more appealing than emotional fireworks. As selectivity develops, the empath's inner world stabilizes. Silence no longer feels like abandonment, and solitude becomes restorative rather than empty. They listen more closely to their body's signals, honoring fatigue, discomfort, and intuition as valid information. This self-attunement sharpens their perception of others, allowing them to engage with greater sincerity and less distortion. Some relationships fade when access is no longer unlimited. This is not a failure of love, but a revelation of structure. What remains are connections built on mutual respect, clarity, and emotional responsibility. The empath's care does not vanish. It becomes concentrated, intentional, and sustainable, carried by choice rather than obligation. Performance arises when connection feels uncertain. It is the subtle habit of adjusting tone, energy, and emotion in order to remain acceptable, needed, or safe. For many sensitive people, especially empaths, this performance becomes so refined that it no longer feels like an act. It feels like personality. Healing begins when the constant effort to manage perception is finally noticed. Presence requires no such effort. It is what remains when the need to impress, soothe, or prove dissolves. Instead of scanning the room for emotional cues to respond to, the empath becomes rooted in their own experience. Attention shifts inward, not in withdrawal, but in alignment. From this grounded place, interaction becomes simpler and more honest. When performance fades, language changes. Words are no longer padded with explanations or softened to avoid reaction. Silence becomes acceptable, even meaningful. The empath stops filling space out of nervousness and allows moments to unfold without interference. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially for those accustomed to earning belonging through emotional labor. Presence is often misinterpreted as passivity, but it is active awareness. It listens without strategizing and responds without rehearsing. There is no internal audience to please, no role to maintain. The empath is no longer acting as a mirror or mediator, but as a participant who is fully there. As presence replaces performance, relationships reorganize. Interactions rooted in validation seeking lose momentum, while those based on authenticity deepen. The empath becomes less predictable, not because they are unstable, but because they are no longer governed by expectation. Their energy settles, and with it comes a quiet authority. Others may feel more seen in their company, not because the empath is doing more, but because they are no longer doing less of themselves. Attention becomes undivided, unfragmented by self-monitoring. What remains is a quality of being that cannot be imitated or forced, a grounded aliveness that invites connection without demanding it. Absorbing is often mistaken for caring. The empath feels another's emotions enter their system as if there were no boundary between inner and outer worlds. Joy, grief, anger, and fear move through them without permission, leaving behind exhaustion and confusion. This absorption creates the illusion of deep connection, but it quietly erodes stability. The empath becomes a container for what others cannot hold, mistaking emotional weight for intimacy. Healing introduces a fundamental shift in orientation. Instead of pulling experiences inward, the empath learns to remain present while allowing emotions to pass through awareness rather than into identity. This is the movement from absorber to witness. Witnessing does not reduce sensitivity, it refines it. The empath still perceives nuance, tone, and unspoken truth, but these perceptions are observed rather than ingested. In witnessing, there is space. Emotions are recognized as movements, not commands. The empath no longer feels compelled to resolve what they perceive or carry what was never theirs. This space brings clarity, and with clarity comes choice. Responses become intentional rather than reflexive, grounded rather than urgent. Being a witness also changes the quality of compassion. Instead of rushing to alleviate discomfort, the empath allows others to encounter their own emotions. Pain is acknowledged without being absorbed, respected without being personalized. This form of presence can feel unsettling to those accustomed to being rescued, yet it is far more empowering. It honors autonomy rather than dependency. As absorption dissolves, the empath's inner world becomes quieter and more coherent. Emotional residue no longer accumulates, and the body begins to trust safety again. The empath can sit with intensity without losing themselves in it. Awareness sharpens, unclouded by overwhelm or guilt. Witnessing restores dignity to both sides of connection. The empath remains intact, and the other is allowed to be whole in their experience. What emerges is a calm attentiveness that sees clearly without interference, a form of care that does not entangle, illuminate without carrying, and remain open without being consumed. And so the healed empath walks through the world with open perception and firm roots. Sensitive, yes, but no longer fragile. Compassionate, yes, but no longer consumable. They become what they were always meant to be. A human being who feels deeply and stands fully and belongs, first and finally, to themselves.